A racist police officer attacked a young black girl right in front of her mother. The bystanders stood frozen, too afraid to intervene. Just when it seemed that no one would step in, Dwayne Johnson appeared. Could he protect the little girl? What would happen next? This story will keep you on the edge of your seat. It's not just about an act of bravery, it's about the fight for justice and equality. You won't believe what happens next. If you love heartwarming and meaningful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the surprises coming your way. And now the story begins. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a brilliant golden glow over the bustling neighborhood park. Laughter echoed as children raced from one end of the playground to the other. Their joyful shouts mingled with the rhythmic squeak of the swings and the gentle rustle of leaves. 7-year-old Emma was at the center of it all. Her braided hair bounced as she giggled and ran across the wood-chipped ground. She paused only to climb onto the jungle gym, her small hands gripping the bars as she called out to her mother. Seated on a nearby bench, Sarah watched her daughter with a soft smile. Her hands loosely held the paperback novel now forgotten in her lap. She was a woman who carried the weight of the world with grace. Her warm brown eyes reflected years of quiet resilience. She scanned the playground, taking in the carefree energy of the children lost in their world of play, the soft chatter of parents nearby. It was a rare moment of peace that she deeply treasured. That peace shattered as a figure emerged at the edge of the park. A white police officer in crisp uniform surveyed the scene with a rigid expression. His presence wasn't entirely unusual. Officers occasionally patrolled the area, but there was something about the way he moved, deliberate and searching, that made Sarah's skin crawl. His eyes swept across the playground, lingering briefly on each child until they stopped on Emma. Sarah's smile faded as the officer began walking toward her daughter. His footsteps were heavy and purposeful, seeming unusually loud amidst the backdrop of children's laughter. An uneasy knot tightened in her stomach. She stood up, her book sliding from her lap to the ground. Emma, oblivious to the approaching figure, was now perched atop the slide, waving enthusiastically to Sarah. The officer stopped at the base of the slide, his tall frame casting a shadow over the little girl. Sarah quickened her pace, her voice catching as she called out to Emma. The officer's voice cut through the air like a blade. "What are you doing here? You don't belong here." His tone was sharp, devoid of the warmth one would expect in a place filled with children. He reached out and grabbed Emma's arm, his grip firm and unyielding. Emma's giggles turned into a startled cry. She struggled against his grasp, her small voice trembling as she called for her mother. Tears began to stream down her cheeks, her confusion and fear palpable. Sarah was there in seconds, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you doing? Let her go." Her voice was steady despite the panic rising within her. The officer didn't release his grip, instead turning to Sarah, his eyes cold. "Ma'am, step back. This is official business." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "That's my daughter. You have no right to touch her like that." She took a step closer, her voice rising, drawing the attention of nearby parents and children. The vibrant atmosphere of the playground began to shift. The joyous noise that once filled the air was now tinged with confusion and unease. The officer's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I need you to step back right now." Sarah refused to move. She reached for Emma's free arm, but the officer shoved her away with surprising force. She staggered but kept her balance. Her eyes blazed with a mix of anger and fear. Emma's cries grew louder. Her small frame trembled under the weight of the confrontation. The tension in the air was suffocating. Each passing second seemed to stretch into an eternity. Other parents began to cautiously approach, their phones raised, capturing the scene unfolding before them. Sarah, her voice choked with emotion, pleaded, "Please, just let her go. She's just a child." The officer's grip on Emma remained unyielding. His actions stood in stark contrast to the warmth and safety the playground was supposed to represent. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she stood her ground. Her love for her daughter transcended her fear. And then, amid the chaos, something shifted in the atmosphere. A tall figure observing from a distance began moving purposefully toward the scene. The approaching presence was steady, unhurried yet filled with an unmistakable resolve. All eyes turned toward him, sensing that the tide of this encounter was about to change. The tension in the air was almost palpable as the tall figure drew closer. His steps were purposeful, his eyes locked onto the scene unfolding in the playground. Dwayne Johnson, unmistakable in his presence, had been enjoying a quiet stroll with his daughters when Emma's frightened cries pierced through the ambient noise. His keen instincts took over, and the sight of a uniformed officer gripping a small, terrified child sent a chill down his spine. He knew he couldn't stand idly by. The children and parents who had been frozen in place now shifted their attention to Dwayne. Whispers rippled through the crowd. His tall, yet composed frame exuded an aura of control. Dwayne's daughters, sensing the urgency, stayed behind with a family friend as he advanced toward the scene. "Hey!" His voice was resolute, cutting through the commotion like a hammer blow. The officer didn't immediately turn, but Emma's cries subsided as she caught sight of the approaching man. "Let her go," Dwayne stated. His tone was deep and unwavering. The officer finally turned, his face etched with annoyance and skepticism. "Sir, step back. This is none of your concern." Dwayne moved closer, closing the distance. With a determined stride, "You're holding a small child who's clearly terrified. That concerns all of us." Emma remained shaken, reaching out toward her mother, who stood caught between fear and relief at the sight of this unexpected ally. Sarah's voice trembled as she tried to speak, but Dwayne raised a hand, signaling for her to remain calm. The officer squared his shoulders, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged so publicly. "This is a matter of law enforcement," he asserted, his voice louder as if volume would reinforce his authority. "Step aside." Dwayne didn't flinch. "A matter of law enforcement? She's a child, and you're scaring her." His words were measured, but the resolve in his voice was unmistakable. "You're the one who needs to step back." The officer's jaw tightened. He glanced at the growing crowd, their phones raised, capturing every moment. The weight of the scrutiny seemed to make him even more uneasy. He released Emma's arm abruptly, but his hand remained clenched, his posture tense. Emma stumbled toward her mother, who pulled her into a protective embrace. "That's enough," Dwayne said, taking another step forward, his imposing figure now standing squarely between the officer and the child. "You don't get to lay your hands on children." The officer, visibly angered, pointed a finger at Dwayne. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Dwayne tilted his head slightly, his voice dropping in volume but not intensity. "What I'm getting myself into is making sure that little girl feels safe again." The officer, clearly flustered, took a step back, but his frustration boiled over. "You think you can just waltz in here and play the hero? This is my job." Dwayne's eyes narrowed. "Your job is to protect, not intimidate." His tone was calm, yet carried a weight that silenced the murmurs in the crowd. "Right now, you're the one who's out of line." The officer looked around, taking in the sea of eyes and camera phones pointed at him. His bravado wavered, and for a moment, he seemed unsure of what to do next. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down completely. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he muttered. His words directed more at the crowd than at Dwayne didn't waver, glancing down at Emma, who was clinging to her mother, her sobs subsiding but her small frame still trembling. He looked back at the officer, his expression hardening. "If your job involves harming children, then yes, I will tell you how to do it. Step back." The tension between them hung heavy in the air, electric and unyielding. The officer met Dwayne's gaze one last time, as if weighing his options before taking a few steps back. The crowd murmured, emboldened by Dwayne's intervention. Some applauded, others shouted words of encouragement. Dwayne turned to Sarah and Emma, his face softening. He crouched down to meet Emma's tear-filled eyes. "Are you okay, sweetie?" he asked gently. Emma nodded hesitantly, her tiny fingers clutching her mother's sleeve. Sarah managed a weak smile, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Thank you." I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Dwayne nodded reassuringly but remained vigilant. The officer was still nearby, simmering with anger, his hand hovering near his radio. Dwayne straightened up, his eyes locking with the officer's once more, silently daring him to escalate the situation further. The officer finally muttered something into his radio and turned away, retreating toward the edge of the park. Dwayne watched him go, his body still tense, ready for anything. Only when the officer disappeared from sight did he exhale, his shoulders relaxing slightly. The crowd began to disperse, some offering words of gratitude as they passed Dwayne. He nodded politely to them but kept his focus on Sarah and Emma. "Are you two going to be all right getting home?" he asked, his tone gentle but laced with concern. Sarah nodded, her voice more resolute now. "We'll be fine, thanks to you." Dwayne glanced at the people gathering around, his jaw tightening. "I don't think this is over," he said, his voice low. "Stay safe, and if anything else happens." He pulled out his phone, quickly exchanging numbers with Sarah. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "We'll call." Dwayne offered Emma one last reassuring smile before stepping back. The tension in the air was beginning to dissipate, but the weight of what had just transpired lingered heavily in the hearts of all who had witnessed it. As Dwayne turned back toward his own family, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The sunlight that had once bathed the park in a warm glow seemed dimmed, overshadowed by an oppressive tension that refused to lift. Dwayne lingered in the park, his eyes scanning the playground, ensuring the officer had truly left. But as he turned to leave, a sharp, commanding voice stopped him in his tracks. "You think you can just walk away?" The officer had returned, his face flushed with anger and frustration. His movements were erratic, his hand still hovering dangerously close to the gun at his hip. Dwayne slowly turned back, his expression unreadable. He locked eyes with the officer, his posture firm yet calm. "I think you've done enough," he said, his voice steady. "Do you really want to do this here, with all these people watching?" The officer stepped closer, ignoring the murmurs of the crowd that had begun to gather again. His eyes darted around for a moment, but his pride propelled him forward. "You don't get to play the hero and walk away like nothing happened. You don't know the whole story." Dwayne tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I know enough. You grabbed a child, you scared her, you hurt her. That's the only story that matters." The officer's lips curled into a sneer. "She was acting suspiciously. I was doing my job." "Suspiciously?" Dwayne's voice rose slightly, his incredulity evident. "She's 7 years old. She was playing on the slide. What exactly about that looked suspicious to you?" The officer hesitated, his jaw clenching as he struggled to find an answer. The silence spoke volumes, and the crowd began to murmur louder. Dwayne took another step forward, closing the distance between them. His presence was as solid as a mountain. "You saw a child having fun, and you decided she didn't belong. That's not doing your job. That's abusing your power, and you know it." The officer's face flushed crimson, his anger simmering. He suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Dwayne's shoulder in an attempt to shove him back. The motion was quick, aggressive, but Dwayne was quicker. His hand shot up, grasping the officer's wrist with a force that stopped him in his tracks. "Don't," Dwayne said firmly, his voice dropping to a low growl. The officer tried to yank his arm free, but Dwayne held on tight. In an instant, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes piercing. "You've crossed the line too many times already. Don't make it worse." The officer finally pulled his arm away, his footing unsteady as he regained his balance. His anger was palpable, but there was also a flicker of doubt creeping into his expression. The crowd had grown larger, their phones raised, recording every second. The officer's eyes darted around nervously. The realization of his actions was slowly sinking in. "You think you're untouchable because people know your name?" He spat, his words laced with bitterness. "You're not above the law." Dwayne folded his arms, his demeanor calm but resolute. "Neither are you. And right now, everyone here can see who's breaking it." The officer clenched his fists, his breathing heavy. He looked around, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on him. The confrontation had turned into a spectacle, one he no longer controlled. The anger on his face began to waver, replaced by something akin to fear. Dwayne took a step back, giving the officer room to retreat. "Go," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "It's over." For a moment, it seemed like the officer would refuse, that his pride would force him to escalate further. But then, the sound of distant sirens wailed, growing louder with each passing second. His face contorted into a grimace as he spun around, striding toward the edge of the park without another word. The crowd erupted as the tension broke, people exchanging glances and comments about what they had just witnessed. Dwayne remained rooted to the spot, watching until the officer disappeared from sight. Only then did he exhale, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Nearby, Sarah and Emma remained huddled together, the little girl clutching her mother's hand. Sarah approached cautiously, her eyes filled with gratitude and lingering fear. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the din of the crowd. Dwayne turned to her, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad she's okay." Sarah nodded, pulling Emma closer. The little girl buried her face in her mother's side, her small frame still trembling. "She's still scared," Sarah said, her voice catching. "I don't know how to make her feel safe again." Dwayne crouched down to Emma's level, his large hand gently resting on her shoulder. "Hey kiddo," he said, his tone warm and reassuring. "You were the bravest one here. You knew what happened wasn't right, but you didn't do anything wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide and wet. "Promise?" she whispered. Dwayne smiled, his expression sincere. "Promise." The sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of more police. Dwayne straightened up, his face hardening once more. "This isn't over," he said quietly to Sarah, "but you're not alone in this." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. As the first police cruiser screeched to a halt, Dwayne stood tall, ready to face whatever came next. The battle wasn't over, but he was prepared to see it through, for Emma, for Sarah, and for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. The sirens blared louder as two police patrol cars pulled up at the edge of the park. Officers emerged, their faces a mix of confusion and caution as they surveyed the scene. The crowd had thinned slightly, but those who remained still held their phones aloft, capturing every moment. Dwayne stood near the playground, his imposing figure unwavering, while Sarah kept a tight hold on Emma beside him. The officer who had instigated the conflict paced nearby, his face flushed with anger and frustration. He approached the arriving officers, gesturing animatedly as he tried to explain his version of events. Dwayne kept his eyes on him, his instincts on high alert, ready for any sudden moves. The first officer from the new group, a woman with a calm demeanor and sharp eyes, approached Dwayne. Her badge glinted in the fading sunlight as she stopped a few feet away from him. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" Dwayne nodded, his voice steady. "That officer," he said, gesturing toward the man currently animatedly explaining himself to another officer, "grabbed a little girl for no reason. He scared her, he hurt her, and he wouldn't let her go. I intervened to stop him." The female officer's expression didn't change, but she cast a quick glance toward Sarah and Emma standing nearby. "Ma'am," she said gently, addressing Sarah, "is this true?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "Yes, my daughter was just playing on the slide. He came up, said she didn't belong here, and grabbed her. She was terrified, and he wouldn't let her go even when I tried to intervene." The female officer's jaw tightened slightly as she nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Please remain here while we sort this out." She turned to the other officers, signaling for them to join her. Dwayne remained where he was, his arms crossed as he watched the group huddled near the officer who had caused the scene. Their voices were low, but tense, and the officer was growing increasingly agitated. "I was doing my job," he exclaimed, his voice carrying to where Dwayne and Sarah stood. That man had no right to interfere. The female officer raised her hand for silence. "We'll handle this, Officer Miller. Please step back for a moment." But Miller wasn't finished. He pointed directly at Dwayne, his face contorted with anger. "He assaulted me. He pushed me back and threatened me." Dwayne's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he held the officer's gaze, his silence a deliberate statement. The female officer turned back to Dwayne. "Is that true?" she asked, her tone even. "I stopped him from hurting a child," Dwayne said simply. If he felt threatened by that, maybe he should think about why. The crowd, still gathered, murmured in agreement. A few voices chimed in. "He's lying. That man didn't do anything wrong. We saw it all." The officer was out of line. The female officer raised her hand again for silence. She turned to Miller, her expression firm. "We'll take this one step at a time. You'll have a chance to explain yourself." Miller opened his mouth to protest, but one of the other officers stepped in, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Let it go," the man muttered, his voice barely audible. Miller stiffened but remained silent. The female officer addressed the crowd next. "If any of you have videos or photos of what happened, we encourage you to share them with us. You can approach my colleagues here or submit them directly to the precinct." People began to move hesitantly toward the officers, their phones raised, offering evidence. Dwayne glanced at Sarah, who was now kneeling beside Emma, stroking her hair gently. His expression softened for a moment before he turned back to the female officer. "What happens now?" he asked. She sighed, clearly weighing her words. "Carefully, we'll review the footage and take statements. This incident will be thoroughly investigated. For now, we need everyone to remain calm." Miller remained seething, muttering something under his breath, but the female officer shot him a sharp look, silencing him once more. She turned back to Dwayne. "Thank you for intervening. We assure you this will be handled appropriately." Dwayne nodded but didn't move from his spot. "I'll stay until I know they're safe," he said, gesturing toward Sarah and Emma. The female officer gave a small, understanding nod. Of course. As the situation began to de-escalate, the crowd slowly dispersed, though a few lingered at a distance, curious to see how things would conclude. Sarah approached Dwayne, her eyes filled with gratitude and lingering exhaustion. "Thank you again," she said softly. "I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't been here." Dwayne offered her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me. This isn't over, but you're not alone in this." Sarah nodded, her grip on Emma tightening protectively. The female officer approached them once more, her tone gentler now. "We'll escort you two home," she said to Sarah, "just to make sure you get there safely." Sarah hesitated, glancing at Dwayne. He gave her an encouraging nod. "Go with them. It's the right call." As Sarah and Emma were led toward a waiting police car, Dwayne stayed behind, watching them leave. The weight of the day settled on his shoulders, but he stood tall, knowing he had done the right thing. Yet, a sense of unease lingered. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The video of the confrontation at the park spread like wildfire within hours. Clips appeared on every major social media platform, shared with captions ranging from outrage to admiration. Actor Dwayne Johnson confronts police officer over child's mistreatment. One headline screamed. Another read, "Hero or troublemaker?" Viral video sparks heated debate. By the next morning, Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Messages flooded in, some from friends and family expressing support, others from strangers sharing words of encouragement or asking for her side of the story. But mixed in with the kindness was a dark undercurrent of online criticism. Comments accused her of escalating the situation or accused her of seeking attention. Sarah switched off her phone, overwhelmed by the sudden scrutiny. Meanwhile, Emma was quieter than usual. She stayed close to Sarah, hesitant to play outside or even talk to her friends. Her bright energy had been extinguished, replaced by a wary caution that broke Sarah's heart. Every time the doorbell rang or a car slowed near their house, Emma would flinch, her small hands gripping her mother's arm tightly. Dwayne wasn't immune to the attention either. His agent called to warn him about the potential backlash, but Dwayne brushed those concerns aside. This wasn't about his career. He had seen something wrong and acted. It was as simple as that. Still, the pressure mounted as media outlets began dissecting his actions. Was he a hero standing up against injustice, or had he overstepped his bounds? Despite the noise, Dwayne remained focused. He stayed in contact with Sarah, reassuring her and Emma. This attention will die down eventually, he told her over the phone, but in the meantime, we need to make sure you two are okay. Sarah appreciated his support, though she couldn't help but worry. Emma wasn't herself, she admitted. She's scared all the time. I don't know how to make her feel safe again. Dwayne was silent, the weight of her words pressing on his chest. Let me come over, he offered. Maybe I can talk to her. Let her know she's not alone in this. Sarah hesitated but eventually agreed. When Dwayne arrived that afternoon, he found Emma curled up on the couch, clutching a stuffed animal tightly. She looked up at him with wide, cautious eyes, her grip on the toy tightening. Dwayne crouched down to her level, his voice gentle and caring. Hi, Emma, he said with a warm smile. Do you remember me? She nodded slowly, her eyes darting toward her mother for reassurance. Sarah gave her an encouraging nod. Dwayne continued, when I saw what was happening, I knew I had to step in because what that man did was wrong. But you were so brave, Emma. Braver than a lot of grown-ups I know. Emma's eyes widened slightly at his words, and a flicker of pride crossed her face. I was brave? She asked softly. Dwayne nodded. You were. And you know what? You're not alone in this. There are a lot of people out there who think you're amazing and want to make sure you're okay. Emma glanced at her mother, then back at Dwayne. Really? Really? Really, he said firmly. And if you ever feel scared, I want you to remember that there are people like me and your mom who will always be here to protect you. Emma's small shoulders relaxed slightly, and she managed a tentative smile. Sarah watched the exchange with tears in her eyes, grateful for Dwayne's kindness and patience. As the days passed, the video continued to generate conversations. Advocacy groups latched onto the story, using it as a rallying cry against systemic injustice. Protests were organized, calling for accountability and reform. Dwayne found himself thrust into a larger movement, one he hadn't planned to lead but couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Emma began to heal. With Dwayne's support, Sarah worked diligently to rebuild her daughter's confidence. They attended community events together, where Emma met other children who shared similar stories. Slowly, her bright spirit began to return. But not everything was resolved. The officer who had instigated the confrontation, now identified as Officer Miller, remained defiant. He publicly defended his actions, claiming he had acted within his authority. His statements only fueled public anger, and calls for his dismissal grew louder. Dwayne knew the fight wasn't over. He met again with Sarah and Emma, this time with a plan. We need to keep this momentum going, he told Sarah. This is bigger than what happened in the park. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this. Sarah agreed, though the prospect of remaining in the public made her anxious. I just want Emma to feel safe, she admitted. She will, Dwayne assured her, and so will a lot of other kids because of what you're doing. The story had taken on a life of its own, drawing attention not only to the incident at the park but to the broader issues it represented. Dwayne, Sarah, and even young Emma had become symbols of resilience and the fight for justice. Their lives were forever changed by a single fateful day. The courtroom air was thick with anticipation. Sarah, holding Emma's hand tightly, sat in their designated spot. Beside them was Dwayne, his presence as solid and reassuring as it had been that day in the park. The room was filled with reporters, community leaders, and advocates who had followed the case with unwavering attention. The investigation into Officer Miller's actions had been thorough and swift. The video evidence coupled with witness testimonies painted a damning picture. Miller's repeated claims of simply doing his job crumbled under the scrutiny of his actions, and today marked the culmination of weeks of public outrage and legal proceedings. The judge entered, and the room hushed as the trial commenced. The prosecutor laid out the case, detailing how Miller's actions not only violated protocol, but also infringed upon the basic rights of a child. Dwayne listened intently, his jaw tightening with each point that underscored the gravity of what Emma had endured. When the defense attorney spoke, he attempted to frame Miller's actions as a mistake, but one made with good intentions. He believed there was a legitimate concern, the attorney argued. It was a misunderstanding, not malice, but the prosecution countered effectively, replaying the video for the entire courtroom to see. Gasps rippled through the audience as the footage showed Miller grabbing Emma, her small frame dwarfed by his imposing presence, her cries echoing painfully in the silent room. When it was Dwayne's turn to testify, he approached the stand with quiet confidence. His words were deliberate and powerful, recounting what he had witnessed and why he had intervened. No child should feel unsafe in a place meant for joy, he said, his voice steady. What I saw that day wasn't about protecting anyone, it was about power, and it was wrong. Sarah testified next, her voice trembling but resolute. She spoke of Emma's fear, how it lingered long after the incident, and her determination to ensure no other family would suffer the same pain. Emma, too young to take the stand, watched silently, her small hand never leaving her mother's. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. Officer Miller was found guilty of misconduct and dismissed from his position. The decision was met with a mix of relief and muted applause from the crowd. While it wouldn't erase what had happened, it was a step toward accountability, a moment of justice in a world that often felt unjust. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing as questions flew. Sarah shielded Emma from the chaos, but Dwayne stood firm, addressing the crowd with the same measured strength he had displayed from the beginning. This isn't just about one officer or one incident, he said. It's about creating a world where every child feels safe, where no one is judged by the color of their skin or where they come from. This is a victory, but the fight doesn't end here. His words resonated, spreading quickly across news outlets and social media. Dwayne's unwavering stance had made him a symbol of courage and justice. But for him, it wasn't about the spotlight. It was about Emma, Sarah, and everyone who had ever felt powerless. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm for Sarah and Emma. The outpouring of support from their community was overwhelming. Local organizations rallied to provide resources, counseling, and safe spaces for families who had experienced similar struggles. Emma slowly but surely began to reclaim her childhood. She smiled more, played outside again, and even started sharing her story with other children, finding strength in her voice. Dwayne remained in contact, visiting often and making sure Sarah and Emma had everything they needed. On one visit, he brought Emma a small bracelet engraved with the words "You are brave." She wore it every day, as a reminder of the strength she had discovered within herself. One afternoon, as they sat in Sarah's living room, Emma climbed onto Dwayne's lap, her face pensive. "You said I was brave," she said softly, "but I was scared." Dwayne smiled, his large hand gently stroking her back. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," he said. "It means you face your fear and keep going anyway. And that's exactly what you did." Emma smiled, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Sarah watched the exchange, her heart overflowing with gratitude. Amid the chaos, they had found something unshakable: hope. In the months that followed, the ripples of that day in the park were still being felt. The local police department implemented new training programs focused on community relations and de-escalation tactics. Advocacy groups gained momentum, pushing for broader reforms. And while Dwayne returned to his life and career, he carried the lessons of that day with him, determined to use his platform to amplify the voices of those who couldn't always speak for themselves. For Sarah and Emma, life went on. There were challenges, but they faced them with the knowledge that they weren't alone. They had found strength in each other and in the support of those who had stood by them. And as Emma ran across the playground one sunny afternoon, her laughter ringing out once more, Sarah knew they had won something more precious than justice. They had won back their joy. The months after the court victory brought both challenges and opportunities for Sarah and Emma. The legal battle was over, but its impact lingered in the corners of their daily lives. Emma was still hesitant sometimes when entering a new space, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting a dark figure to appear. Sarah had worked hard to rebuild her daughter's sense of security, all while navigating her own journey of healing. Their small home, once a haven of quiet routine, now buzzed with the energy of change. Supporters had rallied around them, offering more than just words. There were scholarships for Emma's education, community programs for families, and even a mural painted at the park where the incident had occurred, depicting children of all backgrounds playing together under a banner that read "The space is for everyone." Sarah returned to her job as a teacher, finding new purpose in her work. She brought her experiences into the classroom, encouraging her students to speak up for themselves and others. Her voice carried a weight it hadn't before, one forged by resilience and clarity. She found herself stepping into leadership roles within her community, joining advocacy groups and speaking at local events about the importance of justice and inclusion. Emma also began to grow in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. Initially, she was hesitant to talk about what had happened, but as time passed, she found confidence in sharing her story. Her classmates listened attentively as she described the day she was afraid and how people stood up for her. Before long, Emma became known as a quiet but powerful advocate among her peers. One afternoon, Emma brought home a flyer in her backpack. It was for a youth leadership program focused on teaching kids about standing up for what's right. "Can I join this, Mom?" she asked, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Of course you can," she said. "I think you'd be amazing." Meanwhile, Dwayne remained involved in their lives, though his presence became less frequent as his professional obligations continued. He kept in touch, occasionally sending a text or making a surprise visit to spend time with Emma. On one such visit, he brought her a journal. Its cover was simple, but inside the pages were filled with inspiring quotes and blank spaces for Emma to write her thoughts. "This is for your big ideas," he told her, watching as she flipped through the pages. "You have so much to say, and the world needs to hear it." Emma grinned, hugging the journal to her chest. "I'll write down everything," she said determinedly. As the seasons changed, so did their lives. The park became a familiar place for Sarah and Emma once more, a place of laughter and connection rather than fear. Emma would often run to the swings, her face radiant with the freedom of a reclaimed childhood. Sarah watched her daughter, feeling a profound sense of gratitude, not just for Dwayne's intervention that day, but for the countless strangers who had stood behind them in solidarity. Emma also began to grow in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. Initially, she was hesitant to talk about what had happened, but as time passed, she found confidence in sharing her story. Her classmates listened attentively as she described the day she was afraid and how people stood up for her. Before long, Emma became known as a quiet but powerful advocate among her peers. One afternoon, Emma brought home a flyer in her backpack. It was for a youth leadership program focused on teaching kids about standing up for what's right. "Can I join this, Mom?" she asked, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Of course you can," she said. "I think you'd be amazing." Meanwhile, Dwayne remained involved in their lives, though his presence became less frequent as his professional obligations continued. He kept in touch, occasionally sending a text or making a surprise visit to spend time with Emma. On one such visit, he brought her a journal. Its cover was simple, but inside the pages were filled with inspiring quotes and blank spaces for Emma to write her thoughts. "This is for your big ideas," he told her, watching as she flipped through the pages. "You have so much to say, and the world needs to hear it." Emma grinned, hugging the journal to her chest. "I'll write down everything," she said determinedly. As the seasons changed, so did their lives. The park became a familiar place for Sarah and Emma once more, a place of laughter and connection rather than fear. Emma would often run to the swings, her face radiant with the freedom of a reclaimed childhood. Sarah watched her daughter, feeling a profound sense of gratitude, not just for Dwayne's intervention that day, but for the countless strangers who had stood behind them in solidarity. And then one autumn evening, there was an unexpected knock on the door. Sarah opened it to find a familiar face, Officer Miller. He stood awkwardly on the porch, his posture rigid but his face sincere. Sarah's breath hitched, her instincts screaming to protect Emma, who was playing in the next room, but something in Miller's demeanor made her pause. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quickly, as if sensing her hesitation. I wanted to apologize." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. She hadn't expected this. She had imagined him disappearing into the background after the trial, never crossing their paths again. But here he was, looking genuinely remorseful. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what happened," he continued, "about what I did. I was wrong. There's no excuse for how I treated Emma or you." Sarah folded her arms, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come here?" Miller shifted uncomfortably. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "I've started working with a community outreach program. They've helped me see things differently, things I was blind to before. I know an apology won't undo the harm I caused, but I wanted you to hear it from me." Sarah studied him for a long moment. His words seemed genuine, but trust wasn't easily rebuilt. Still, she nodded, her voice even. "Emma has been through enough," she said. "If you're truly serious about changing, prove it by making sure no one else has to go through what we did." Miller nodded, his face a mix of relief and regret. "I will," he said. "Thank you for listening." Sarah watched him leave, her emotions swirling. As she closed the door, Emma appeared beside her, her small hand slipping into Sarah's. "Who was that, Mom?" she asked. "No one you need to worry about," Sarah said, crouching down to face her daughter. "Just someone trying to make things right." Emma nodded, her faith in her mother unwavering. She held up her journal. "I wrote a poem today," she said proudly. Sarah smiled, pulling her daughter into a hug. "You're going to change the world someday, Emma," she said softly. "I can already see it." As the evening settled into a peaceful quiet, Sarah realized that while the scars from their experience might never fully disappear, they had found something far more enduring, a sense of purpose, strength, and hope. Their story was no longer just about what had been taken from them. It was about what they had gained and what they would build together. This story is a reminder of the power of courage, resilience, and unity. Have you ever faced a difficult situation and stood up for the vulnerable? Have you ever witnessed positive change created from small acts? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Your voice can inspire and empower others. If you found this story meaningful, please don't hesitate to share it with your friends and family. Together, let's spread the message of courage, resilience, and unity to build a better community. Thank you for watching and supporting. Let's take action together to create positive change, one small but meaningful step at a time. Wishing you peace and happiness. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe for the latest updates. These stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the assistance of AI. If there are any errors, please forgive them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.